Now everybody repeat. Don't mean a thing. Finish it up. Do they have that swing? They got that swing. Thank you, Georgia State. And I forgot to mention these young lads, but as you can see in this program, it's comprised of 4 people. And the other one is Mr. Francisco Laura and Jaden. But it's in your program. We don't want to miss anybody. And Ms. Littleton, thank you so very much. You are inspiring, and you look marvelous. Excuse me a minute. I got to check my stash. I had my back turned for a minute. Wait a minute. Who been in my stash? Was it you? You? Was it you? You offered this prior. You had something. Was you? All right. Let's watch it now. Now listen. That's my stash, and I can't be sharing it because good hooch doesn't come cheap. And although we be friends in here, you got to get your own giggle juice. All right. Well, let's keep the celebration started because we keep it going because you know what we up against. Our first presenter is Dr. Dwight Andrews. He is a pastor of the First Congregational Church and professor of music at Emory University. After Dr. Andrews presents, the Georgia State Swinging Jazz Band will play another tune. Right now, help me welcome Dr. Andrews.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to have a few minutes with you today to talk about the jazz age from an African-American perspective. I'm not sure if I can give it from an African-American perspective, but I can give you some sense of the jazz age from my perspective. I'm a jazz saxophonist, and I also teach music, history, and culture and theory at Emory University. I teach a course in the history of jazz, and one of the things I try to stress with my young students is the complicated way in which jazz evolves. Jazz is really, I think, a mirror to American culture and history. And even as we celebrate with these wonderful young musicians of the great legacy of jazz to all of the 20th century, we have to also acknowledge that there's another side, there's a darker side to the history of the music. And that when we look at jazz, we don't want to just look at the way it swings and the way it makes us feel. We want to look at the way in which it was forged, the culture, the history, the problems, the dark side, which helps to make jazz. The great historian Leroy Jones once says that if you look at the music and the people are the same. And so from the blues, which comes out of the blues experience, he said that, people have the blues because after slavery, Lincoln said, you all are free, but America didn't make any space for them to be free. They were not prepared to be free, and consequently they had to sing the blues. And that always stayed with me because that's a way of understanding kind of where the blues and where the spirituals come from. It comes from an expression of understanding hope and possibility in the midst of great existential odds. And so I want to just lay out for you from my perspective of the jazz age, because in some ways I think our romance with the 1920s, with the roaring 20s, with the flappers, with the ladies smoking cigarettes, with the women's suffrage movement, all of those things are romance even with gangsters and Al Capone and bootleg liquor and the speakeasies. We've kind of mythologized that in a kind of way that makes us really say, those were the good old days. But in fact, if we look at it, those were some complicated, not so good old days. They were days that were really forged out of the realities of racism, out of Jim Crow. The Great Migration came because people not only wanted economic opportunity, as you noted, Mrs. Littleton, but also because they were leaving the South because of lynching and fear and the way in which the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups literally terrorized black communities. And so this is a very personal story for me because my own people who came from Georgia and from Alabama, they left Georgia and Alabama to go to Detroit so they could work for a guy by the name of Henry Ford. And so this is a very, very personal story. And they never had a romance about going back down south because down south was not a great story for them. And so all of my understanding of the complicated nature of black culture and especially the history of jazz is forged in this, I think, really rich and deep understanding. If any of you ever saw Ken Burns' great documentary on the history of jazz, Ken points to some of the issues about the history of our people and of our culture, but in some ways I think he didn't have enough time to talk about the ways in which race and racism, the ways in which the police, the ways in which a union card would help you to get work or not get work. He doesn't really get a chance to go into the ways in which the idea of jazz as the devil's music comes from this long legacy of thinking about black people as being evil. And these are tropes that came to us well into the 20th century from the 19th century, from minstrelsy. The story about Ma Rainey is that Ma Rainey began as a black minstrel. And if you know anything about minstrelsy, minstrelsy was a very weird American experience in which white actors would put on black cork and imitate blacks in a plantation kind of setting, completely mollifying what slavery really was. It was kind of recreating what slavery was. We had songs like Old Black Joe, in which an old slave is just lamenting. I just wish I could go back to those good old days when they called me Old Black Joe. It was a complete myth. But that was the myth in which the first black entertainers, Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, came into through black minstrelsy, believe it or not. Now, luckily, they didn't have to wear blackface, but many of the early black vaudeville entertainers did have to wear blackface. Burt Williams and others, they worked in New York in vaudeville and early Broadway with face. So you have blacks putting on makeup, imitating whites, imitating blacks with makeup. This is kind of the strangeness, as Don King would say, only in America could you have such a weird kind of legacy of all of this. But it goes much deeper than that. For me, from my perspective, the irony of jazz is that it really is a story in black and white. It really is a story in black and white. The first people who were thought to be jazz musicians were the New Orleans Rhythm Kings and the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Ironically, two white groups got to make the first jazz records. And they were known throughout the world as the originators of jazz. They didn't give any credit to Buddy Bolden or to the early New Orleans musicians, but the whole appearance of jazz was as a white innovation by white Americans. When Paul Whiteman decided to create symphonic jazz, he was made the king of jazz. No mention of Louis Armstrong, no mention of Duke Ellington or Fletcher Henderson. So there's a process in America of what I call racial erasure, where African Americans create something, it becomes very, very important, and through a very long, complicated process, their creativity, their contribution is literally erased. Think about your grandchildren who know about Elvis Presley, but don't know about Chuck Berry. This is a part of that racial erasure process. Think about people who know George Gershwin, but don't recall that George Gershwin hung out with William Grant Still and Duke Ellington in New York. Think about the ways in which even Stravinsky himself, who was fascinated by ragtime, didn't understand that it was an African-American creation until much later in the 1930s. So we have musics that are having great impact on the modern sensibilities, but oftentimes we don't think of them as these complicated African-American creations that they in fact are. Think about the famous Cotton Club, which all of you have heard of. That's part of our romance with the jazz age. But we all know that the Cotton Club was a club that was owned by whites, and it was not only owned by whites, but most importantly, it catered to white audiences. It was the black performers who were on stage, but it was the white audiences that paid for it. And so the black patrons in Harlem went to the Rhythm Club. They went to the Savoy. They went to where the black people hung out. And then we remember, though, the Cotton Club, the legacy of that. Once again, a very, very strong and complicated picture in black and white. Why did they call jazz the devil's music? Because of the association of jazz with illegal activities. We all know, how many of you have ever heard of Storyville in New Orleans? Okay, so we know about Storyville. This was the 38 square block area of legalized prostitution in Louisiana. In New Orleans, it was where all of those great musicians like Jelly Roll Morton played. Because in those legal bordellos, they had parlors where solo jazz musicians would play to entertain the patrons, I guess, or those would-be patrons. But look at this rich, complicated moment in American history. New Orleans, a great port city, where sailors are coming in from the Caribbean, where the culture of the Caribbean is still reinforcing itself in a place like New Orleans. And then you have this concentrated little neighborhood where we have both prostitutes and this burgeoning new music called jazz. Isn't it interesting that when they closed Storyville down, many of those musicians went where? They went north, they went west, and they went east. And so there's a certain social history that goes along with our understanding of jazz that I think is equally rich and equally complicated. In some ways, when the musicians go to Chicago, what do they encounter? They encounter all of the illegal graft that's going on with the speakeasies and with a growing illicit liquor situation with prohibition. What does prohibition do? It makes a lot of money for illegal businesses. And it creates literally this hotbed of employment for people like Louis Armstrong, who is maintained by people like Al Capone. So we have all of these complicated relationships between the music and the social setting in which they exist. These are the parts that I think often get cut off from our understanding of the music. In a sense, we kind of like to dance to the music, but we don't always want to confront the full story of how we got to the music. And I do think you're right. History has a way of repeating itself. And that very same racial erasure, that same commodification of the music, and the devaluing of the people continues to this very day. It's fascinating to me how rap and hip hop continue some tropes that go all the way back to the 1830s, all the way back to minstrelsy. So when my young students think about popular culture as being the cutting edge of things, oftentimes it's difficult for them to confront the reality that popular culture often is very conservative and keeps in place the status quo in terms of the way we value or devalue the people. Isn't that interesting? The more influence the commodification has, the more it kind of contorts our understanding of the creativity of all of it. So my students, for example, admire Jay-Z, and they admire Beyonce. But they don't think about the ways in which that kind of commodification also not only says something about black creativity, it actually in some ways inhibits black creativity. Because now success is judged by what? Not by creative expression, but by money and popularity. In other words, you get on TMZ or you get on Good Morning America because you triple platinumed yourself or you got on Grammy. And because of all of this has put jazz, ironically, from my perspective, at the margins. Everybody is not a Wynton Marsalis. God bless him. I'm glad that we have Wynton Marsalis. But most of the musicians who will make a commitment to this music and all that it demands will not become Wynton Marsalis or Harry Connick Jr. And so in some ways we say we value the culture, but I'm not sure from my perspective if we really want to fully acknowledge both the trajectory and also the creators of this music. So from my perspective, as we celebrate 100 years since the Roaring '20s, what that celebrates also is the great exotica and the romanticizing of what jazz represented to the people that F. Scott Fitzgerald spoke of. And in a kind of ironic way, we cut all of that kind of exotica, that notion of what white people were really enjoying about the Roaring '20s, dancing and the flappers and women smoking cigarettes and cutting their hair and actually dancing and touching each other when they danced. I mean, that was pretty amazing in the 1920s. And so because of that, though, we had the Ladies' Home Journal talking about, does jazz put the sin in syncopation? Okay? This was a real article. There were real medical journals that spoke to the ways in which those syncopations of jazz would cause your nervous system to become so erratic that your daughters will run away from home and get pregnant. So there was this great fear of this music that was associated with black folks and black people because they linked, in a sense, the stereotypes and the archetypes with the music, and then created a whole level of discussion. And so when we look at the way in which hip-hop is deemed to be acceptable or not acceptable today, I think it is a way of looking at the way in which, in America, as Don King would say, only in America can we look at the ways in which we commodify and understand creative process. So from my perspective, jazz is an amazing expression all by itself. But the reality is, I think it's most valuable when we see the connections of how we got here and why it sounds the way it sounds and why we value it because of the way it makes it feel. Thank you very much. I know I have to obey my time. Thank you.